I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So nice to meet you. Thanks for having me here. This is going to be the topic of this presentation, exploring and understanding medical device vulnerabilities. It's really just a case study actually of some of the experiences that I had when we started looking at medical devices and trying to find vulnerabilities within them. Some of the things are pretty straightforward, but I think some of the other things are kind of surprising, to tell you the truth. We just want to share that with you guys. But before we start, I guess there's some thanks that I have, like for Mike, always such a gracious host, and Bart. I know he's running around like trying to keep everything under control and put fires out, so I really appreciate you guys having us out. ICS cert, everything that we talk about here has been reported to DHS via ICS cert. That's just kind of our standard operating procedure that we do. And then the vendors, of course, because they always have a big play in whatever it is that we do here. So who are you? I'm Billy Rios. Right now I'm a managing director at Silence. I guess now I'm the global managing director. I don't know if that's a promotion or a punishment, but I guess what it is what it is. So, but I had a startup called SpearPoint. I was a founder, CEO. Silence had actually acquired SpearPoint Security, which is pretty neat. I worked at Google for a period of time. I was a technical lead there. I think that's like the best job to have at Google as a tech lead, because you run engineering and run engineers and stuff. It's really cool. I also worked at Microsoft as a security program manager there, security program manager for Internet Explorer. Saw a lot of interesting things. I've been on the other side. I know what it's like to have 0 days dropped against you, or have to patch things and push patches out to 800 million users. That's always a lot of fun. I worked at E&Y for a while. I worked at DISA, and I was in the Marine Corps, so don't hold that against me, please. I've grown my hair out, so. But I guess, as far as what we're going to look at today, when we first started looking at medical stuff, I'm not a medical device researcher by trade or anything like that. I just thought they were very interesting. I'm really familiar with the ICS space, the industrial control system space. And so when we started looking at medical devices, one thing that we realized is that, hey, let's say you have this MRI device, that's really cool. And at the end of the day, it's really just a computer running this process that's associated with the MRI device. And it's important to understand how that process works. But at the same time, it's always important to understand that there's likely some workstation that an operator or an engineer will use to actually operate this device, right? Whether it's an MRI workstation or something else. And so these things are always linked together, right? And they may or may not operate independently. It just depends on the system that's in play. So, and then there's people, right? There's always people associated with this as well. So a lot of times when you look at technology, we're very, very focused on technology, especially the geeks, but it's always important to remember that there's people involved. So if we make any changes to the technology, or if we recommend changes to the technology, we always have to be cognizant that at the end of the day, there's someone that's going to be using this technology to try to get something done. And so we always have to be aware of that. And then at the same time, we start to see that there's more things involved here, right? So there's these workstations. They want to capture this data because capturing data is really cool. It allows you to do really good things in the future. And then that's hooked up to a network so people can access that data and look at that data and modify that data. And then the next thing you know is that there's all these ways to consume that data. And so basically what we have is we just have this huge network of stuff, right? And we call this the ecosystem. So for any researcher in the future that wants to look at a medical device, when you look at a particular device or a particular piece of software, always realize that there's this ecosystem that basically is around that device or that software, right? It's never standalone. So if you see a medical device, I know you may buy it from eBay or something like that, and you have it on your desk at your lab or whatever, and it's just sitting there by itself. In the real world, it's not like that. That thing doesn't just sit there by itself. There's a whole ecosystem of stuff that supports that device or that software, right? And so no matter what it is that we do, whether it's we make a recommendation or find a vulnerability or whatever it is, it's this whole ecosystem that's involved, right? Whether it's a doctor on an iPad trying to get some data from some certain scan that happened a week ago that's stored on a database, it's an ecosystem, right? And that's something that we always have to be cognizant of. So. And then we're going to go into like one specific case. So the Philips Expert, I had a chance to look at this, but I want to actually walk you through the experience I went through when we looked at this particular device. So that top question up there, where did you get this? That was the one question that was asked of me the most when we were reporting this through the chain, whether it's through DHS, whether through as the vendor or anyone else. Are like, where did you get this, right? And so when we tried to get some medical devices, what we did is the first thing we did is we searched eBay. And the reason we searched eBay is because we're so comfortable with that, because in the ICS space, if you want to buy an industrial control system device like a PLC or software for industrial control system or SCADA, you just go to eBay and buy it. You just buy a used one. So that's the first place that we searched. And then we found resellers, like a reseller like MedWow, right? Where I don't know if there's an internet connection here, but you can actually just go to medwow.com and just see all the used, medical devices that they're selling. We thought that was pretty cool. We found a reseller, and we saw that they had an X-ray machine, and I was like, that is really awesome. And I talked to my wife, and she's like, no way, you can't have an X-ray machine in the house. We got 2 young kids, like one's 4 years old, and the other's 2 years old. They're like, no way, no X-ray machines in the house. And I was like, okay. And then I was like, well, I'm going to buy this anyway. I'll just lock my office door. But the reseller was like, no, you can't have this. And I was like, why not? You're selling this thing. I've got the money. Just ship this thing to my house. I've got Amazon Prime. And they're like, no, you can't do that. You actually need to have a license to buy certain things like radiological equipment, right? And so I was like, well, I don't have that license. How do I get one of these? And they're like, if you don't have it, we're not going to talk to you. And they just hung up, right? And I was like, dude, come on, man. I know what's going on. Like, this stuff's not that dangerous, right? Like, I've watched a lot of House. I know how to work an X-ray machine. They should sell this thing to me, but they wouldn't. So the next thing we tried to buy was a surgical laser. We thought that'd be pretty cool, right? We're like, oh man, we can't get the X-ray machine. This thing definitely doesn't have any radioactive pieces in it, so we'll just buy this laser, right? And they're like, no. You got to have another license. If you want to buy certain classes of lasers, you have to have a license to buy that. And if you don't have the license, you need to get out of here, right? And I was like, man, that's not cool. So the next thing we asked them, I was like, is there anything that doesn't require a license that you could sell me? And they're like, yeah, we got lots of stuff, right? So we ended up buying all sorts of stuff. So like the Philips Expert, for example, right? We're like, oh yeah, let's just buy this thing. We bought some other things too. We got some technician software, all this. So part of this point is that if someone wants to get some of your hardware or whatever, they'll probably be able to get it. So we were trying to go through the more reputable resellers like MedWow or whatever, but we saw a lot of places out there that will probably just sell you anything as long as you had the money and were willing to pick it up or whatever. So that's something to keep in mind, especially when folks are asking the question like, hey, where did you get this? Where did you get this? Where did you get this? At the end of the day, it's like, what does it matter? Like where I got this from, right? So when this thing got shipped to me, it actually arrived in this huge box, and I get a lot of stuff shipped to me. And my wife hates it because she knows it's just some other thing that could possibly hurt our kids that I'm going to be storing in my garage for a really long time, claiming to do research on it. But for this particular one, when it arrived at my house, I opened up the box and I looked at the actual device itself, and the device actually had an inventory tag from a hospital in Utah. So I won't say which one, but I was like, wow, this is pretty crazy. And so the first thing I was really worried about was, is there patient data on this device, right? I was actually really worried about that. And so what we did was, go back. So what I did is I freaked out a little bit, and then what we did is just image the device because it actually had a hard drive. We just took a forensically sound copy of the hard drive. That took about a night, and then we just went on our way and started booting it up. It was running Windows XP, pretty amazing. We're like, wow. And then we searched that image to make sure that there's no patient data on there. There was not any patient data on there, thank God. So, but we'll talk about some of the other things that we found. The first thing we realized that there's some service listening on some weird port. We fired up a 6-line Python fuzzer. We literally just threw 40,000 A's at the port, and this is what happens, right? So we're looking at the debugger, and we're like, wow, this is a straight up heap overflow on Windows XP. Pretty straightforward, right? Where's Jared DeMott, right? Yeah, there we go. We're looking through the class notes for his class. We're like, okay, man, how do we write the exploit for this thing, right? Because we're about to send this to ICS cert. Word up. And so that was just a few minutes. It took literally like 5 minutes, and it's pretty classic, pretty just straightforward exploit. No exploit mitigations, no dep, no ASLR, nothing like that. Just really, really straightforward. So, and then we noticed something really interesting. We said, hey, now that we have system on this box, what are we going to do? The first thing you always would do is like dump password hashes, and then we just crack those password hashes. And this is what we came up with, these passwords here. So very, very interesting, right? So we actually talked to the vendor. We're like, hey, we came across these passwords. Well, we're not sure whether or not they belong to you or whether they belong to the hospital. So, but either way, it's bad, right? And so the first time we talked to them, they're like, those aren't our creds. And we're like, okay, yeah, they must belong to the hospital. And then I think like a couple weeks later, they're like, hey, remember when we told you those creds didn't belong to us? Those actually belong to us, right? So we're like, that's kind of interesting. And so they actually included this in the report. This is actually fixed in a field change order, A3000171. So, and this is where things get really interesting. So that field change order basically makes it so our technician has to go to every single box and basically update this here. So, and those technicians, let's say the heap overflow, for example, let's say the technician wanted to update that. They don't have a Philips Expert update like Windows Update where they can just say, hey, just download the latest. What actually has to happen is a technician actually has to go to each one of these devices and update the device. And the way they do that is by using these passwords up here. These are the technician passwords. So a technician would go to this device, to a hospital, and they would actually use these passwords to log into the device in order to update it. And so when we knew what these passwords were, we can now actually go to these devices and do anything administrative to them, right? And so obviously these devices are not meant to be shared with the public, but we just happened to discover them, right? And so this was actually the thing that they were most worried about. So the heap overflow, they're like, oh yeah, that's a couple lines of code, we can fix that, no problem. What they're really worried about is this, right? Because once again, when we talk about that ecosystem, when we look at this slide, it's just 3 passwords, right? That's not that big of a deal, right? Wrong, right? Because this device has a whole ecosystem to support it, right? There's technician manuals, there's technician training, there's software, there's all this stuff that's involved with these devices. And when you figure something like this out, all that stuff has to be changed. So all that training that the technician went through that said, hey, this is the password that you use to log into this device to do administration, that's got to change. Like every single PowerPoint slide that they created with those passwords in it has to change. Those technician manuals that they give out to all the technicians in order to service this thing has to change, right? So this is actually a big deal, and this is probably a bigger deal than that heap overflow that we found. In fact, that's what the vendor told us. They said, the heap overflow we're not worried about. This thing we're really worried about, right? So that's actually a hard spot for them to be in. A very hard spot. So, but I know what you're saying, right? I know what you're saying. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking right there. You're saying, wow, Billy, you're really good looking. But as far as technical skill, I think you just got lucky, right? So, and that could be the truth, right? Maybe I did just get lucky. So, but we found some other passwords too, right? So these things, like we said in the ecosystem, this thing authenticates to a database someplace because capturing data in a point in time is interesting, but storing data over a long period of time and doing trend analysis is even more interesting, right? Especially if you're trying to enable something good for a patient, right? So in order to authenticate to the SQL server, those are the passwords that authenticate to the SQL server, right? And these are also in the technician manuals because this is how it communicates with the database. This is how this thing is configured and set up, and this is how it works, right? And then, of course, there's a local account on the SQL server itself, which has that username and password as well, obviously running as admin, right? So you start to see how this thing kind of spiders out, spiders out, spiders out. So, and all this is going to be fixed in that field change order. So, and now I know what you're saying too. You're like, you just got one bad apple, right? Everyone else is good. You got one bad apple here. So here's some others, right? And I don't want to talk about where these belong to because it's not important. It's pointless to say call out vendors or whatever. But a lot of places do this, right? So in fact, if you go to a medical device organization, or if you go to a medical or healthcare organization, and you go and you talk to them about certain pieces of equipment that they have, they may not even own that equipment. They may just lease it from someplace. And so they can't do anything to it. They can't touch it. They can't update it. They can't do any of that stuff. So a lot of the responsibility will fall on the vendor, right? And the way that the vendor administers these things is by having things like this, right? Like passwords, technician passwords is what they call them, right? And so as soon as someone figures out what these technician passwords are, they will also have the ability to administer that device as well. Right, so I think that's the most important takeaway here. And it's not limited to any particular vendor, specific vendor. It's not limited to any specific line of device or anything like that. It's pretty much just across the board because this is the way they do business. This is just the way that they manage and administer these devices. So very different than a lot of other industries we've seen, right? So it's like, wow, what does all this mean? You crack the code, you're really elite, and these things, they're supposed to be restricted. This is from a technician manual that we saw that actually listed the service passwords. It said, hey, here are the service passwords for this particular device. These things are restricted. They're not meant to be shared with anyone else, right? But I think most of the people in the audience know that when you have something like this, people that you don't want to get those secrets will get those secrets, right? If it's printed in a manual or if it's among technicians, if it's in someone else's environment, if you take a server and put it in someone else's environment, someone is going to get the passwords for that server, right? You've lost control of the server. And so I definitely think it's two different varying perspectives here. Folks who are trying to do their job, do technician-related things, fix devices, fix software, and they want to have a means to do that. A lot of times that's a technician password. And then there's our perspective, right, where it's like, as soon as that server goes out the door, everything that's on that server is known to the public, right? And that's how we think as security researchers. I think the reality is probably somewhere in between, like in the middle, but it's a good perspective to have from both sides, right, to understand what's going on. So restricted, approved licensee personnel only. So as you saw, I watch a lot of house, but I don't have licenses to buy most medical equipment. And then so we kept going, and we found a lot of passwords, right? And there's no point in showing what the actual passwords are or where they belong to, so they're grayed out. But if you look at the little column count over there to the left, it's kind of hard to see. But we had this Excel spreadsheet where it's like almost 300 of these passwords belonging to various medical devices, belong to various manufacturers. And we're saying and this is what they're all used for on the right-hand side, right? It's like a default password. It's either used for calibration, it's used for diagnostics, it's a service password, a service mode, factory mode. Basically, we were just allowed to log into the device and just make major changes or configuration changes to the device, right? So it's pretty much systemic across a lot of medical devices and software. And personally, I think we can't have something like this. It's very low-hanging fruit when it comes to the security community, finding stuff like this. If we found stuff like this in any other software or hardware device, it just wouldn't be acceptable. Hopefully we can get to the point where medical devices are the same way. So just some more stuff, just to show you this is actual technician manual, right? Where they say, hey, when you set this thing up, this is how you set it up. This is how you set up the wireless. These are the keys that you should use, or these are the default keys. This is the way you should set these things up. And this is very important to make sure that things are working correctly, right? But we should always remember that if it's in print somewhere, as soon as that manual goes out the door off the printing press, it's not a secret anymore, right? It's definitely not a secret anymore. So at the end of the day, I don't think we really need help finding more backdoor passwords. So at the end of the day, we found about 300. The reason we stopped is because we thought getting to 301 is just pointless, right? So we reported all this to DHS and we said, hey, something probably needs to be done here. And there's actually a lot of things I think we can do. Some of them are really cheap. And some of them are really expensive, right? So, and here's just a list of them. Like I said, at the end of the day, I'm by no means a medical device security expert or anything like that. I'm just a researcher. We're just looking at these devices, but I think this is some of the stuff that we can do. Actually, number 2, I think the FDA is starting to work on number 2, which I think is awesome. That's really, really good. So number 1, we really like number 1 because, to be honest, it's pretty cheap, right? I don't know if there's anyone from Nintendo. I know there's guys from Microsoft here. I don't know if there's anyone from Sony here, but every Nintendo Wii in the world runs signed firmware. Every iPhone, iPad in the world, they run signed firmware. In fact, things like the Nintendo Wii, they only run signed games. And like the iPad only runs signed apps, right? And so if they can do it for a $199 device, I'm pretty sure they can do it for a device that costs a lot more, right? And this makes it to where even if someone does manage to get hold of a technician password or a service password, they won't be able to use that to actually alter the core functionality of the device, right? They won't be able to just swap the firmware out unless they, of course, they get a key from one of the organizations, which is really bad. So, and then there's some other stuff that folks can do. I think they vary in the level of cost and expense, but I think they're just good things to do, right? So, and I think that's all I have. About 20 minutes worth. I don't know if there's questions or not. I probably won't be able to answer them, to tell you the truth. So,
Billy Manning Garcia at CodenomiCON.
Yeah.
So how does, this seems like 10 years ago or maybe 15 years ago. So is that your perspective that the reason why they're so far behind is because they thought that no one would ever try? Or, I don't understand. Why would they, why would they follow this methodology? Is it because they thought they were in closed systems and never going to be connected to anything and no one would ever figure out these backdoor passwords? Or was it, what's your method, what's your idea of why this is so far behind?
I don't know. And I don't really want to speculate. What I do know is that their perspective is a lot different than ours, right? So having grown up with things like Windows and SQL Server and MySQL and those softwares have taken their licks over time and they've figured it out almost, right, as far as process goes. I'm not sure. I can't say why, but what I do know is that industry is very different, right? And they have things that they want to get done. And I think for a long time they were just asking themselves, how do we get those things done in the most efficient manner possible? Right, and maybe that's how this got here. But as far as how this worked out, I'm not sure. I can have some creative things that I think of, but so. Right. Yeah.
So sort of common sense security principles fell out of favor to getting it to market as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that costs money, right? So, and if you're not experienced in working in that industry, if you don't have someone kind of guiding you, it's hard to do that, right? So what I don't want to do is just say, hey, they're stupid, they don't know what they're doing. They just have a different perspective, right? And I think that's something that we have to understand. It's very important because you can't just say, hey, you should be doing this all along. You just have to recognize that they have an ecosystem, they have things that they want to get done, they have a certain culture. And that's just the way that they are, right? And so we have to recognize that, acknowledge that, and then work with them to try to fix things. So, yeah.
Billy.
What was the manufacturing year of that device? Do you recall?
It's still in service, so it's hard to get like version numbers and stuff for them because we asked, and it's really weird. But what's really cool though is actually they knew where every device was in, well, most of the devices were in every organization because they actually leased those to the hospitals, I guess. And so they had a pretty good understanding of where they were like across the world and which versions were being run where. They wouldn't give that to me, even though I asked like many times. I was like, can you give me that spreadsheet? But they would never do that. But that's kind of neat though, yeah.
Billy, can you for a moment recount your experience? Because I've heard this from a lot of researchers. How difficult was it for you to get to the right person at the organization? And when you did finally get through, who's the first person they put you in touch with?
Yeah. So maybe one thing vendors can kind of work on, whether you're a healthcare organization or a vendor, is making it easy for folks to contact a security relevant person. Because we actually really had a hard time contacting a vendor directly. And then the last thing we did is we contacted DHS. We're like, hey, you guys probably know how to get in contact with these folks because I know you know the industrial control system side for this particular vendor. They probably have some bridge over to the medical device side, right? And they didn't know either. And the story that they told me was they literally called a receptionist and said, hey, we're with the U.S. government. We need to talk to someone who knows security, and they need to call this guy. His name is Billy Rios. Here's his phone number. And so I think I was in Miami, and I got a call from someone. It was actually their marketing guy. And he was like, hey, everything's good. Don't worry about it. This doesn't affect our latest version. Those aren't our passwords and that sort of stuff, right? And I was like, oh, okay. That sounds really cool. And then I was like, so if this doesn't affect the latest version, it sounds like it's patched. I'd like to talk about some of the details for this thing. And the guy's like, no, wait. I'm going to get you in contact with our security guy. I was like, yeah, that's the guy I need to talk to. So it was a pretty interesting experience. And hopefully, I think those are very easy things to change, right? It's literally just some real quick policy or designating someone, hey, you're going to run point on these security issues. Most of these companies have security folks anyway. It's just making sure that they get in contact with the right people. So thanks for asking the question. Very important. So, I don't know if there's anything else.
Any other questions for Billy? Great. Thanks again,
Yeah,
Billy.
thanks,
Great
guys.
research.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate you coming out.